Nice to see you, Todd. Long time. It's Bill Weiler.
Hi, Bill.
Hello. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you.
Hey, all, welcome. I'm going to go ahead and just chat for a little bit here to say hello to people, because otherwise it's like we're walking into a big silent room, and that always feels uncomfortable. So maybe it's just me. I'm uncomfortable with silence. Got to work on that, Tom. So we'll get started here. We're going to wait about 5 minutes for people to enter, and we're expecting about 30 or so people tonight, but we never know exactly how many we end up getting. So please make yourself comfortable. If you need to grab some refreshments, we have a really great presentation for you tonight. And I'm gonna just mute myself for a second and get myself a drink of water, because I have to chat here and I don't want a dry voice. So I will be right back. All right. For folks who've just joined, I think we're still waiting for some people, and we'll go here in a couple minutes. We'll get started with our presentation this evening. So please enjoy the lovely view of the creek here. This is Abernathy Creek that's showing in my first slide, and this is one of the main stems that we work with. And got some exciting news that I'll share here in a moment about Abernathy Creek tonight. So, but of course, we'll be talking about Abernathy Creek and learning about it from John and from Todd. So excited for that. All right. While we're getting set up here too, I'll just mention that the chat should be open to you all, and we'll be using that this evening for questions. And if you want to type in the chat, we also are happy to have you, if you'd like to share your camera at some point and raise a hand to say, hey, I have a question. our presenters this evening have agreed that they want to kind of answer questions as they roll along with the presentation. So that's a very nice style of format, a little natural, more natural perhaps than Zoom usually allows us to do. So, and who knows, maybe if cases continue to decline, we'll hold these in person at some point. Although I suspect that'll be maybe in the fall is the soonest we do something like that. But hopefully we'll be able to see each other at public events. I know there's some public events coming up this weekend for folks, big, exciting outdoor events, probably some of the first to be held. Our friends at Johnson Creek and Tryon Creek both have events going on this weekend, invasive species removal and planting, all kinds of good stuff. So, please do tune in for that if that's something that's of interest to you. I'm sure you can get more information about signing up for those events. So, all right, I'm going to switch over here to a slightly different mode. And by the ticking of my clock, it looks like it's 6:37. Do clocks tick anymore? I don't think so. Phones, they just do what they do. Hey, so I think we'll jump in right now. So if it's all right, what I'd like to do is welcome you all to our second webinar as a part of the Watershed Wealth webinar series. My name is Tom Gaskill, and I'm the Executive Director for the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council. I'll be your host this evening. And then I also want to introduce a couple of folks that have been working with me quite a bit over the past few months. So I want to introduce Derek Palmore. Derek, if you could wave, great. He's our Stewardship Involvement Coordinator. And Willow Michaels is our Community Outreach Coordinator. And Derek and Willow are both serving as AmeriCorps members through the Confluence Environmental Center, and they've been working super hard to get this series together. So thank you both, Derek and Willow, for your help. All right. So Greater Oregon City Watershed Council, what's our vision? Our vision is a watershed where healthy streams support abundant native fish and other species. Council began in 2004, and it's supported by a dedicated core of volunteer board members. And they've been working on these conditions in our watershed and around Oregon City for nearly 2 decades. So they are remarkable folks, and I'm really grateful to have them as a part of our team, or for me to be a part of their team, I guess I should say. So where do we work and what do we do? This is where we work, and we work in Abernathy and Beaver Parrot Basins, and you'll be learning a lot more about those this evening, along with these creeks that flow into the Willamette near Oregon City, both above and below Willamette Falls, which is kind of cool. What do we do? Habitat restoration, invasive species removal, technical assistance, education and outreach, and stakeholder engagement. And our program tonight is supported by a community enhancement grant from Metro and the City of Oregon City. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is jump into introducing our speakers for tonight. So John Runyon and Todd Alsbury, I met, I think, about the same time, which was at my first board meeting, or maybe just before, back in April of last year. And I had no idea at the time that I really had a couple of talking books that were a part of the team that had been working with this watershed almost as long as the council has, maybe as long as the council has, that have authored numerous reports that really delve into the science to describe these watersheds, from the geology through the fisheries and all of the different tributaries and all of the different elements that make up what is the Greater Oregon City watershed area of focus. They're also just really remarkable people. And so it's my pleasure to introduce John Runyon and Todd Alsbury as tonight's speakers. Thank you. Thank you both. So John, I've got you muted. I see Todd is unmuted.
You need to
Oh.
stop share.
Righto, sorry.
Okay.
I was distracted by my phone buzzing there. Sorry about that.
Oops. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Great. So again, my name is John Runyon. I am a watershed planning consultant, and it's kind of a cool gig. I get to work with watershed councils and explore watersheds all over the state of Oregon. And what I really enjoy about exploring watersheds and this work is I get to know watersheds in a way that very few people do. And to me, watersheds are like people. They have a unique personality. And in the case of watersheds, that personality comes from its setting. What kind of stream flows does it have? What's its geology? What kinds of vegetation does it have along the stream? How has it changed historically over time? What's the land uses in the watershed, population density, a whole group of characteristics that you can bring together and really understand what makes a watershed tick. And for the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council, what I'm going to do tonight is talk about the setting for the watersheds and set up essentially a framework that shows you how stream flow, riparian areas, sediment, and other factors have influenced the watershed and what the current conditions are. That will set the stage for my friend Todd to come on and talk about fish species. So I'm setting the stage, I'm providing the watershed context, and Todd will talk about fish species, what's limiting them, their distribution, et cetera. Let's see, why isn't it advancing? Huh. There we go. So as Tom said when he laid out the Watershed Council's territory, really there are 3 watersheds that are unique that comprise the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council watersheds. First one is the Willamette tributaries, which are very small streams that kind of pour off the bluffs that are just right along the Willamette River. Most of those streams don't have fish. And they're sort of unique because they're just draining an urban area for the most part. Then there's Abernathy Creek, which I'll talk about in more detail, and Beaver Parrot Creek, which I'll talk about in more detail. So it's important to understand that where these 3 systems empty into the Willamette River really defines a big part of how they function in terms of fish in particular. So Abernathy Creek enters the Willamette River at mile 25, just below Willamette Falls. It's tidally influenced at its confluence with the river. A lot of people don't realize that that the Willamette River is subject to tidal influence, and in areas it can be as much as 3, almost 4 feet, depending on where you are. And that really varies the elevations right at the mouth of Abernathy Creek at this stage. The tidal influence goes all the way up to Willamette Falls. And when you think of tides, you think of salt water. In this case, it's a freshwater tide. What happens is the Columbia River, when the tide is rising, pushes up and creates a wedge of water that pushes up the Columbia and then into the Willamette. By the time it reaches the Willamette, it's just fresh water, and that's what influences the tides. So Abernathy Creek is below Willamette Falls, so it's tidally influenced, and that also influences the fish populations, which we'll talk about. Beaver Creek, of which Parrot Creek is a large tributary to it, enters the Willamette River above Willamette Falls at river mile 31.4. So this system is not tidally influenced, and it enters above the falls. The Willamette River watershed, as I said, consists of small tributaries that begin within Oregon City and then flow over steep bluffs into the river. For the most part, these small streams are very high gradient, very, very small, and they do not contain fish. There's one exception to that. In some cases, where they enter the Willamette River, there's a small area where it interacts with the river and you can have fish there. But for the most part, when you look at that system, the Willamette River watershed, there is very little fish use. So again, the layout of the three watersheds, and it's important to note in the Beaver Parrot system, the two streams converge or come together fairly close to the Willamette River. So you have kind of two independent streams, one's more to the north, one more to the south. The one that's more to the north, as we'll talk about, really receives a lot of water from Oregon City, which has an impact on the watershed itself. So this is just kind of the watersheds by the numbers here in terms of total area in acres, percentage within the UGB. And the UGB is the urban growth boundary. And that's the area where, through Oregon land use planning laws, development is really concentrated. So that's where you have the higher density development. And it's important when you look at a watershed to understand where that watershed is relative to the UGB. And you can see the variability here when you look at the total acres. Abernathy and Beaver are roughly the same, 21,573 for Abernathy, 20,083 acres for Beaver. Willamette's considerably smaller, 2,697 acres. So overall, you're looking at a little over 44,000 acres that comprises all the watersheds for the Greater Oregon City Council. So I have total area in acres within the UGB. And there you can see that Abernathy has a large area within the UGB. But when you look at it relative to the overall area, it's only 16% in the UGB. The rest of it is into rural residential areas and forestry areas. Beaver has a smaller area within the UGB, about 13% of the overall watershed. And then Willamette, not surprisingly, almost 60% of the areas within the UGB. So there's a lot of concentrated development within the Willamette watershed. And then overall, about 17% of the area is within the UGB. So what's interesting about this system is you have the urbanization down in the lower part of the watershed. And as we'll see when we look at land use and other patterns, you have more scattered development, less development pressure, more sort of agricultural, rural residential, and forestry trending into the upper watershed. So this is a look at the land uses, land cover within the watershed. And you can see where whoops, go back here. You can see where Oregon City is, and that's urban land cover there. And we talked about that within the UGB, and you can see the UGB boundary there. If you look at the aggregate for all of the watersheds, about 46% is in agricultural land uses. And that this includes, a number of different crop types. 23% primarily in the very, very upper part of the watershed is in forest, but it also includes scattered small woodlots in various parts of the watershed. 4% Christmas trees. You drive around out there and you certainly see Christmas tree farms, and 4% approximately roads and rail lines. So that gives you a sense for the kind of land cover, and that land cover really influences the streams in a number of ways, and we'll see those. One of the ways that land cover influences the stream is impervious surfaces. So what is impervious surfaces? An impervious surface is an area like pavements, sidewalk, roofs, where if water hits it, it just runs off. And in many cases, it'll run off into the stormwater system and directly into the streams. So it's really important to understand impervious surfaces within a watershed, because in those areas, you tend to get very flashy hydrology. It'll rain hard and then drain immediately into the stream, as in contrast to other areas where it will hit native vegetation or natural vegetation, soils, and absorb into the soils, into the aquifer. Where you have impervious surfaces, you don't have that. So it's important to understand that. And what this is looking at percent impervious surfaces within the contributing watershed. And we divided it up into smaller watersheds for each of these tributaries so that you could see what percent of the area is contributing from impervious surfaces. And in our kind of world at looking at stream function, good is less than 5% impervious surface area overall within a watershed. You still have pretty good infiltration. You don't have as flashy of streams when you have less than 5% impervious surfaces. Fair is 5 to 10% impervious surfaces. You're starting to see more flashy streams, more sediment getting into the water as you get rainstorms, that sort of thing. And then the worst is poor, where you have greater than 10% impervious surfaces. And there have been a number of studies that have shown when you have more than 10% impervious surfaces, you really see stream degradation in terms of how that stream functions. In terms of stream flows, you can end up with streams over time that cut down into the soils and are in size because they have flows that exceed what they naturally would get. You can see sedimentation because impervious surfaces tend to convey sediment very quickly into the stream systems. So you really want to try to minimize impervious surface. And one way you can do that is what they call effective impervious surface, where you try to disconnect storm drains and that sort of thing so they don't go into the stream, and you try to create swales and other things that will allow natural infiltration of stormwater off of sidewalks, streets, and roofs rather than into the stream system. What's interesting about this map showing relative impervious surfaces is you note that several of the streams in the Willamette watershed, of course, have very, very poor ratings for impervious surfaces, probably exceeding over 20% because they're primarily located within the urban core of Oregon City. If you look at Abernathy Creek, for the most part, Abernathy Creek is either fair to good in terms of impervious surfaces because of the way it's arrayed into forest and more agricultural areas, rural residential. It has less impervious surface. Newell Creek is kind of a hybrid of the two. It does have relatively high impervious surface in its very, very upper watershed. The lower watershed, interestingly enough, as we'll talk about later, really does not have a lot of impervious surface. So what you're seeing here is the headwaters contributing impervious surface area to Newell Creek, which has significance in terms of stormwater inputs. Then if you go over to Beaver Creek, which is in the northern part of the Beaver Parrot system, you can see a number of red lines there from tributaries coming in, and then Beaver Creek itself. That's because it's draining that northern part of Oregon City, and that's contributing fairly high impervious surface areas to the stream. So when you look at Beaver Creek, you think it's mostly an agricultural area, but in fact, Lower Beaver Creek is subject to increased flows during rain events and increased sediment because of the amount of impervious surfaces to the south, to the north. In contrast, Parrot Creek, for the most part, is really good in terms of impervious surfaces because it's draining primarily agricultural areas. So this is a map from a recent Metro assessment that both Todd and I participated in. And what this shows is a lower Abernathy Creek. You can see Newell Creek Canyon, and then Abernathy Creek flowing along here. And then there's Holcomb Potter Creek in this upper portion here, which is a big tributary, significant tributary into Abernathy Creek. What's an important takeaway from this historical vegetation coverage, and this was pieced together from surveys that were done in the 1850s, 1860s, where land surveyors were out and noted what the vegetation was at that time. We take that as sort of pre-European settlement vegetation types before we came in, logged it, converted to agricultural and other land uses. And what you have is a mix of closed canopy coniferous forest and then forest woodland areas like up here in the corner. What is significant about that is this is a map that shows white oak patches, and significant portions of the Abernathy Creek watershed, and in fact the Beaver Parrot watershed, particularly in the lower portions, historically had large areas that were oak savanna, where you'd have, you know, large white oak trees and sort of grassland areas in between. And those areas were managed by the native indigenous populations with periodic fires that kept it open and kept conifers at bay, so they didn't shade out the white oak patches. What's significant now is there's a big effort within the Willamette Basin to try to restore and protect white oak habitats, white oak woodland and white oak savanna habitats. And again, that's a key historical habitat in lower Abernathy, upper Potter Creek, Holcomb Creek, and then within particularly the lower Parrot and Beaver Creek watershed. And so there's still remnant patches of oak woodlands out there. When we did this assessment for Metro, and both Todd and I worked on that, this is an area, particularly in upper Potter Creek, well, and actually lower Parrot and Beaver, where Metro and other entities are looking at how can they conserve what we already have in terms of existing patches and try to expand those patches out. This is significant from my perspective, particularly in Abernathy Creek, because the Holcomb Potter system is growing. Right now, it's pretty fragmented. There are a lot of sort of 5-acre ranchettes out there, along with other sort of agricultural operations, et cetera. But there's a lot of growth that's going to be focused into that area. And so there are a number of folks that are looking at, okay, how can we get ahead of that growth, protect existing white oak habitats, and try to expand them out. So that's a significant sort of upland habitat feature that you have within your watersheds. So the Holcomb Potter Creek system. It's important to note that there are some significant Metro conservation properties in the watershed. There's Newell Creek Canyon and New Creek and Maple Lane, and that's over 329 acres. I'll show you a map where all these are located. Upper Abernathy Creek, there's a small acreage up there in the upper watershed that's primarily forest at 107 acres. And then there's Willamette Narrows, which is 112 acres right along the Willamette River. This map shows the locations.
Hey, John, sorry, I'm going to jump in. We've got a question here that pertains to impervious surfaces. And I don't know if you want to jump on that now or, okay. So the question is, how do impervious surfaces correlate with pollution levels, particularly urban spaces versus agricultural runoff?
So it corresponds very closely to runoff pollutants and a number of pollutants that can come off in stormwater, for example, off of impervious surfaces, streets, sidewalks, roofs, include residue from tires, which can include zinc and other materials. There's often oils. You think about like the first big storm that you have in at the end of the summer in September or early October, where you've had dry streets for quite a while. They will a lot of different pollutants will be sort of deposited on the streets, including oils from cars, et cetera. And when you get that first flush of the season, that can go right into the stream system. There are cases, particularly that have been documented, particularly up in Puget Sound, where there's been direct mortality, for example, of coho salmon when exposed to really high levels of pollutants from stormwater. So it is significant. It is a significant issue. And I think we'll talk about it later when we talk about water quality issues. Agricultural areas, yes, there are pollutants there. Certainly sedimentation can be high coming off of agricultural areas. And then there are things like herbicides, pesticides, et cetera, that can also be a pollutant. Fertilizers can contribute, like nitrogen, to the stream. But I would say the biggest concern because it's often very concentrated is stormwater. And that's why there's a big push to try to disconnect some stormwater systems or when there's new development, to create systems that don't drain directly into the stream, that go into swales and will infiltrate down, that sort of thing, so you don't get the entry of pollutants.
Great, thanks, John. And just to remind folks, if you'd like to type questions in the chat, John or Todd can address those during or at the end of the talk. All right, thanks.
So one of the other things that shapes watersheds is vegetation near the stream. We call it riparian vegetation. And really kind of loosely, the definition of riparian vegetation is vegetation that influences the stream, but the stream also influences it through changes in hydrology, soil moisture, just air temperature. So you often will have unique vegetation next to the stream that you won't see in other areas. So one of the things we did for the watershed assessment is we assessed riparian trees. And what we wanted to understand was, where were there trees over 20 inches dimension at breast height? So these are fairly large trees, and we looked at them per 100 feet of riparian area. And as you can see, almost the entire watershed is less than one tree per 1,000 feet. There are some exceptions when you get into the upper watershed for Abernathy Creek, where you have maybe one or two and occasionally 3 trees per 1,000 feet. Those are really low levels of trees for the most part of that size class. And the reason we're emphasizing that is because those larger trees, when they fall in the stream, well, actually, when they're growing there, they're providing a lot of shade for the stream because they're large, they have a big canopy cover. Over time, when they fall into the stream because of blowover, or they become old or decadent, they enter the stream, that size is really important because they create stable wood. Often they'll collect other pieces of wood against them, and that creates pools, hiding cover, really important habitat for fish. And I know Todd will be talking about that in more detail, but the take home here is, because of past land use practices, because of forest harvest, because of agricultural clearing and other activities, we've lost those big trees along riparian areas. And those areas now are subject to higher levels of protection and restoration. So we're looking at into the future, and we're looking at, literally dozens to hundreds of years, we will have the older, larger trees next to the stream as we had historically. And that's one of the key areas of restoration. And I know the Watershed Council's engaged with landowners looking at planting trees in riparian areas. And it's really important to look at a range of species, but conifers are key because they are durable wood that lasts a long time once they're in the stream. We also looked at riparian area shade, effective shade, and that is basically shade that is effective in terms of minimizing water temperature increases on the stream. So we looked at it throughout the Abernathy and Beaver Parrot system. And for the most part, we're seeing fairly low effective shade in the system. And it's low to moderate in most areas. There's some where you see in red here where there's almost no shade over the stream. And one of those areas is Beaver Lake in the upper watershed, which is a artificial impoundment. There's a dam there, and it's created a large area without shade in the upper watershed, which has significance, as we'll talk about later, for water temperature, because you have this huge area that can absorb solar energy, heat up, and then release that into Abernathy Creek. And it's really at a kind of a key point in the watershed in terms of where it's arrayed. And it's an important component to understand in terms of water temperature and really other things like fish passage. One of the other key characteristics for a watershed is how does it respond to floods? The Beaver Parrot and Abernathy systems are unique because they're really low elevation. You very seldom get persistent snowpack in the upper watershed. You think of like the high Cascades, where you'll get snowpack that will fall in the winter and that will persist in some cases into June, that creates release of colder water into both streams and the aquifers that tend to keep streams at cooler temperatures. In addition, because the Abernathy and Beaver systems are low elevation, They're really flashy and subject to rain events. They're really not driven by snowmelt. They're driven by rain events. And this is from a flood in 2009, which here in Beaver Creek, obviously is at flood stage. And you can see that because it's flowing out into the broader floodplain, into the forest adjacent. And both Abernathy and Beaver systems have flooding issues that can affect properties, particularly in the Abernathy system. There's been issues there with chronic localized flooding, flooding homes, roads, et cetera, during high flow events. The big flood of that certainly within my career, and I can remember it, is the February 9, 1996 flood. And what this map shows, it's really interesting, is it shows the flood extent and here primarily the Willamette River backing into Abernathy Creek. And during an extreme event like this, you get floodwaters backing all the way up into Holcomb Creek, which is a considerable distance up the Abernathy Creek system. So you have a unique situation here where both Abernathy Creek is flooding, the Willamette is flooding, and it's backing up into Abernathy Creek and carrying upstream all the way up to Holcomb Creek, which is a lot of backwatering from the Willamette River. So really interesting. So the lower portions of like Newell Creek is flooded and et cetera. So an important consideration when you think about floods, it's not just within the stream system itself here, it's also influenced by the Willamette River because it can back up into the stream channel. So what are the key water quality issues in the watershed? I would say that the big ones are water withdrawals, and water withdrawals are a key water quality issue because it reduces the amount of water in the stream, which during the summer, when they're typically pulling water out of the stream, can increase stream temperature. So it really is an indirect way to get to the next one, which is stream temperatures. Stream temperatures are significant, as we'll look at, particularly in terms of how they influence fish. Fish, particularly salmonids, trout, salmon, steelhead, et cetera, have pretty narrow temperature tolerances, and they want streams kind of on the cooler side. And then sediment is a big issue in these systems. I showed you that map earlier that showed elevated sediment loads in the system, and it's fairly high. Other issues include, as I mentioned, stormwater quality. The only reason I say it's an other water quality issue here is because you do have limited areas and impervious surfaces. It's not like some urban streams like Johnson Creek, where you have huge areas of the watershed impervious surfaces. Here, it's mainly confined to the lower portion. The other issue is bacteria, which primarily comes from livestock. And this is more an issue for like water contact sports, that sort of thing, if you're in the water and the bacteria are there. The other is nutrients, particularly off of agricultural areas, nitrogen, phosphorus, et cetera, which can increase, for example, algae growth in the streams. This is a look at water withdrawal points throughout the watershed. And these are points that are registered with the Oregon Water Resources Department. They're probably unauthorized withdrawals that are happening out there. And you can see that there's almost 100 points within the watershed, pretty high density of water withdrawal within both the Beaver system and the Abernathy system. We're not always sure if all these water rights are exercised, but they're on the books. And this is significant in these systems because, as I said, they're very low elevation. You don't have persistent snowpack. And so it naturally has low flows come July, August, September of the year. You get very low flows, and that contributes to temperature and other water quality problems for particularly for fish. And these water withdrawals can exacerbate that because you're pulling more water out. You've got less surface area to heat up, so it heats up more from solar radiation, et cetera. I think this is an area in the future the Watershed Council might want to look at in terms of how to minimize water withdrawals from the system, because as we move forward into an era of climate change where it's predicted we'll have more droughts, more low stream flows into that August, September period, it's really important to look at opportunities to get more stream flow into the stream channels. And water withdrawals are one way to do that. This is a graph that shows water temperatures, and it's arrayed as a 7-day average maximum water temperatures. What that is looking out over a 7-day period, what is the average maximum water temperature? And the reason we want to look at maximum is that's the one that has the most impact on fish, particularly salmonids, trout, and salmon. The top red line here is just about 68 degrees, a little over 68 degrees. And that is for fish migration. And then you have, whoops, shouldn't go back. I don't want to do that. There's the fish. And then the bottom one is a little over 64 degrees, which is for fish rearing. And if you look at these temperatures, this upper one is just below the Beaver Lake. So that first sort of dashed blue line is right below Beaver Lake, and that's fairly elevated. And it, for a period of time, gets out of sort of that sweet spot where there's high temperatures here in August. This was primarily collected in August. Then you look at Abernathy Creek above Holcomb Creek, it's cooler. Upper Potter Creek is even cooler still. Lower Holcomb Creek is cool. And then when you get into Upper Holcomb at the very bottom there, it's even cooler. So in general, Abernathy tends to be warmer. Those tributary streams tend to be cooler. And that's really significant because you want to have areas where fish, for example, when it's too warm in Abernathy, can nose into these colder tributaries. And I know that there's a project right now the Watershed Council is working on to restore fish habitat in Lower Holcomb Creek in an area really close to its confluence with Abernathy Creek. And the idea there is let's protect and to the extent we can restore that cold water tributary so that it offers refugia for those fish that are trying to escape warm water in Abernathy Creek. I talked about sediment, and this is a map showing modeled increases of sediment over historical background levels. And basically what this is looking at changes in vegetation, changes in land use over time, and then using that to predict what sediment levels will be in the system. And based on my walking around on bunch of streams out there and Todd walking around the streams out there, there certainly is an issue with sediment in the system. What's interesting about this map is sediment's certainly elevated in Abernathy Creek, but it's even more elevated in Beaver Creek because Beaver Creek doesn't really have the large forested areas in the upper watershed that Abernathy Creek has. It's pretty much agricultural with some small woodlots throughout the system. So different land uses there contribute to higher sediment loads. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd, now that I've provided you with some background on the watershed, to talk about fish.
All right, thanks, John. Appreciate that. All right, so I thank you everybody for staying with us as opposed to joining President Biden's State of the Union address. That might be more important nationally and globally, but we have more important local things to talk about here. So to talk about the fish and how they use the watersheds and where they're distributed, I'll start with the salmon and trout species that are present in these watersheds, starting with coho salmon. Coho salmon are a fish that spawns in the late fall, and these fish rear in freshwater for up to 18 months before they actually migrate back out to the ocean. So thinking about that, the juvenile coho salmon will spend at least one summer having to go all the way through the peak summer temperatures before they actually will migrate back out to the ocean. One thing about coho salmon is they're not native above Willamette Falls, and that's because Willamette Falls historically provided a barrier, a natural barrier to coho. So any fish that tried to navigate over the falls prior to winter months was not able to, and simply because you have a large waterfall that They simply couldn't ascend. As the hydropower developed and a fish ladder was constructed, coho salmon were then allowed to access streams above the falls, including Beaver and Parrot Creek. And I'll speak about that again in a minute. Fall Chinook salmon are also another salmon species that is present in Abernathy Creek. They spawn in mid-fall. They rear in freshwater for 1 to 6 months, so significantly less time than coho do. Fall Chinook are currently extirpated, meaning they are no longer present in the Abernathy Creek watershed. And that's largely due to the habitat degradation that has occurred in the extreme lower portions of the watershed where Chinook salmon are most likely to be present. Chum salmon also used to historically be present in the watershed, Abernathy Creek, but not above the falls again. They spawned in late fall and would rear in freshwater for a very short amount of time before migrating to the estuary. And they are currently also extirpated from the Abernathy watershed. They may be a choice of a reintroduction, as ODFW is currently undertaking reintroduction efforts for chum salmon. And they may look at Abernathy as a possible option if habitat conditions improve and are able to support their growth and survival. Winter steelhead is a fish that occupies both Abernathy and the Beaver Parrot Creek watersheds. They spawn in late winter and early spring, and they rear in freshwater for 1 to 3 years. So they can actually be exposed to summer rearing conditions for 2 summers, as opposed to coho that might spend 1 summer. Winter steelhead are the anadromous form of rainbow trout. So rainbow trout that is a resident form stays in the stream, versus the winter steelhead that migrates to the ocean and matures in the ocean to become a much larger fish than the rainbow trout that stays resident in the stream. Those rainbow trout that stay resident in the stream spawn in late winter and early spring, and resident means they just remain in the river of origin for their entire life history. Cutthroat trout are present in both Beaver, Parrot, and Abernathy. They spawn in mid to late winter, and they have various rearing life history strategies, including resident, where the fish stay within the stream, fluvial, where these fish move out to the Willamette River and actually grow and mature, where they have a better food source or better winter rearing conditions in some cases. And then there's also anadromous cutthroat trout that migrate to the ocean and mature to come back and spawn in their natal stream. Go ahead, John. Other native fish species, lampreys, very important. Abernathy Creek is very important to lamprey. There's Pacific lamprey, river lamprey, as well as brook lamprey that are present in all the watersheds. Lampreys spawn in mid to late spring, and their rearing occurs in fine sediments. So knowing that Abernathy Creek is somewhat high in fine sediment doesn't necessarily impact lamprey rearing. It can impact lamprey spawning, but lamprey rearing is actually benefited on certain occasions by fine sediments. So Abernathy Creek is a very important watershed for lamprey due to its proximity to Willamette Falls. It's the last tributary before these lamprey have a very significant impediment to get over, especially now that the hydro system has been developed. And when lamprey are passing over the falls, much of the water at Willamette Falls actually goes through the hydro facility. So these fish need to find small rivulets of water that are coming through the falls to find their way up. And up until recently, there hasn't been a specific passage device for these lamprey to get up over Willamette Falls. Yeah, you are all Pacific lamprey efforts, that's right. Okay, so large scale sucker are also present in Abernathy Creek. They're a migratory fish. Mountain whitefish are also present, another migratory fish. And then there's also sculpins, dace, shiners, and other native minnow species that are present in many of our local streams. We also have non-native fish species. There's bass, crappie, bluegill, a fish called a weatherfish. That's an exotic aquarium fish, as well as goldfish, where people will oftentimes just release their fish that used to be an aquarium fish into the nearby waterway, and that is simply not a very good thing to do. Bass, crappie, and bluegill are oftentimes stocked into ponds in the watershed. ODFW tries to prevent that from happening by not allowing permits for stocking of those kinds of fish in ponds that are connected to the streams, but unfortunately that still occurs. And another unfortunate thing is conditions are becoming more suitable for non-native fish species as temperatures increase. Okay. So here's a distribution map showing the distribution of actually coho and winter steelhead in both watersheds. And this doesn't show the extent of cutthroat trout distribution, which actually in some cases goes a little farther up than coho and steelhead distribution. But this is primarily where our fish are found in both these watersheds. Now in the Beaver Parrot Creek watershed, what you see is currently accessible, but for many years, most of that watershed was inaccessible due to a dam at the mouth of the watershed at Sevchik Pond. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But we have fish in the Abernathy watershed all the way up to essentially the South Lower Highland Road, if you're familiar with that area. And another interesting thing is you'll see how close the Clackamas watershed and the Abernathy watershed are in this map, where the stream on the far right of this map is actually Upper Clear Creek in the Clackamas watershed, and it's within about a half mile of streams in the Abernathy Creek watershed. A pretty neat place. Okay, John, go ahead. So fish habitat conditions in the watershed have been severely impacted by development, and what John went over was a good description of how that development has occurred and how it's had impacts on the watershed. Past timber harvest, and I say past timber harvest because the previous harvest was much more extensive than what's currently going on in the Abernathy watershed. There was clear cutting that went on, which is no longer occurring. Harvest is managed in much more of a conservative manner, and we can expect that conditions in the forest are going to be improving in the future. As well, streamside development also, in combination with that timber harvest, significantly altered in-stream and riparian habitat conditions. It reduced the source of large wood that is contributed to streams. So instead of having a large number of trees that would naturally fall into the stream, those trees were unfortunately harvested and removed from the watershed. Large wood provides complex structure, and complex structure is basically the rocks and the small interstitial spaces that juvenile fish use to hide and also feed and forage on aquatic insects. It creates and maintains critical spawning habitat for adults and that complex cover habitat for juvenile fish. The development impacted riparian areas and shade provided by large mature trees, and that led to increases in stream temperature, again, as John mentioned. I have another graph to show you here next, but the limits on riparian coverage simply increase solar radiation and allow non-native plant species to survive or thrive in the riparian areas. Go ahead, John. So the lack of large wood, these are factors that limit the production of and survival of fish in these watersheds. The primary one is the lack of large wood that creates and maintains pools and that complex habitat that I spoke about. You see a couple of photos here with, on the left, a large pool, but very little wood and very little complexity to the habitat that is there. The photo on the right, a riparian area that has very little shade and has allowed non-native Himalayan blackberry to thrive and then dominate the riparian area, so there's no cover. The reduced shade leads to increases in stream temperature. Go ahead, John. And this is another graph showing temperature throughout the entire June to, I think, September period. And this really shows how high water temperature can get in this watershed. When John surveyed, he had a little bit better year than we did when we surveyed here, where the lower Abernathy Creek got to over 80 degrees. And that is the 7-day average daily max. The reason this occurred is because of Beaver Creek, which again, I'll talk about in a minute. But these peak summer temperatures can reach levels that can be lethal to fish. You know, water temperatures over about 72 degrees can be severely impactful to fish if they can't find cold water refuge or otherwise cooler temperatures, you know, to get away from that hot water. Ideal rearing conditions are 50 to 55 degrees. The temperatures that John was mentioning previously are DEQ maxes for migration and rearing. They're not the best suited, but the best suited temperature is about 55 degrees. Anything more than that, fish need to eat more because they're typically moving more. Their metabolism is at a higher rate, so they need more food to be able to, you know, keep as fit as they normally would be. Now, Beaver Lake, again, I mentioned, has a significant influence on temperature downstream. As you can see here, it's hard to see the difference between these colors of the streams that are represented, but the bottom line here is basically Abernathy Creek upstream of Beaver Lake. The top blue line is Abernathy Creek downstream of Beaver Lake. So we had over a 10-degree increase in temperature from upstream to downstream simply due to the open surface, you know, high amount of surface area with no protection from solar radiation. So the stream significantly increases, you know, as it moves down through the lake. John, go ahead. Other factors limiting fish production, and again, John mentioned these: the excess fine sediment that's contributed to streams as a result of road development, and that's both county roads, timber roads, you know, private access roads that are getting to, you know, development in and along the stream corridor, agricultural areas, which again are very widespread in both of these basins, as well as development in the riparian corridor. That excess fine sediment impacts gravel quality, so fish don't have as much success spawning. And it also reduces pool habitat volume and quality, so juveniles don't simply have as much habitat to rear in. This photo on the right here shows a pool that is simply filled with fine sediments that otherwise might be 2 to 3 feet deep and provide good rearing opportunity. Another thing is those fine sediments impact aquatic insect production, which is the basis for juvenile fish to forage on, is aquatic insects until they reach a large enough size that they can actually feed on larger forage food. Okay, John, go ahead. Other factors limiting production are barriers to upstream passage of migratory fish. The first one is actually at the mouth of Abernathy Creek, where the Highway 99E culvert passes over Abernathy Creek, and it creates a partial barrier to upstream passage. When I say a partial barrier, is that most fish can make it at most of the time, but low flows may restrict fish access due to the fact that it is a smooth bottom surface and velocity of water might be too high on certain occasions. So it does look like there's an opportunity to retrofit this culvert, which could improve passage, because a replacement would be a very, very expensive endeavor. So might be something that we want to look at in the future to ensure that fish have access and unrestricted access into the watershed. The biggest problem in the watershed is Beaver Lake and the impoundment at Mapano Dam. It creates a partial barrier to upstream passage of adult salmon and lampreys into the upper portion of the watershed. Adult salmon again, they do have access into the upper basin, but even spawning survey information shows that there might be 10 fish spawning in the upper basin where there's, might be several hundred in the lower basin. So there appears to be something going on there that at least restricts adult salmon. Lamprey may only have the opportunity of getting over the dam by swimming up the dam face, which is quite a challenge for them. So it appears that the dam at Beaver Lake, which is in Abernathy Creek, not in Beaver Creek, is a significant impediment to lampreys. Now, in the Beaver Parrot Creek watershed, as I mentioned earlier, the Sevchik Pond was a pond that existed, I believe, for at least the last 30, 40 years. It was constructed along with a development that was proposed for the area. There was a large dam that failed once back in 2008 and allowed migratory fish to get upstream. It was unfortunately rebuilt, and then it failed again before the owners decided not to rebuild it the last time. Road culverts on smaller tributaries can also limit access to very critical cool water refuge. As we've mentioned, with the water temperature just continuing to increase, this cool water refuge in tributaries is critically important for fish that do spawn in the lower portion of the watershed. There is a significant amount of spawning that does occur in the lower watershed, but we need to make sure that those juvenile fish have access to cool water refugia. Otherwise, they may perish during the summer months. Okay, John. So where's the good news? I think, we've kind of gone through a lot of, sour notes about, these watersheds, but this being said, there is current habitat conditions in the Abernathy and Newell Creek, Holcomb Creek, and Thimble Creek that do support native fish production and can actually be good places for fish to go and spawn and rear. Lamprey, coho, and winter steelhead do spawn in large numbers in a specific reach of lower Abernathy Creek. But as I mentioned, with temperatures approaching 80 degrees in midsummer, those fish need access to cool water refugia. There are restoration actions underway, like we mentioned, Holcomb Creek, which would improve cool water refugia. These are meant to restore degraded conditions in the watershed. And the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council is leading that effort to restore critical habitats needed by our fish to survive. I'm very happy to be part of that, and I think that is it. So if we have questions, we're happy to answer.
All right, Todd, thank you very much. And John, great job. I think, I know for me, I was taking notes and picking up on a lot of different things that are news to me. So, and I'm supposed to be directing the rudder for this whole endeavor. So great opportunity to learn more about these watersheds from you both. If folks do have questions, feel free. We can kind of do this as more of a chat. You can type them in the chat, or if you have questions and want to just unmute yourself, we can do that as well. Or I can call on people. I'll just change my view here so I can see everybody. One of the questions I think that I have is, and this is maybe a question for you both, but is there a place that if you had to prioritize, if you had to say, this is the place where this watershed council should really be pushing hard in terms of restoration? We have kind of an interesting condition here because we have these different basins. And I know Abernathy Creek, we've done an action plan for that. But what would be the one type of effort that you think this council should push on as hard as possible right now to get the greatest the greatest gain for the watershed? Is it, is it in-stream restoration with logs? Is it focused on trying to remove barriers to fish passage? Is it shading the streams? Is it looking at, trying to get cool water refugia for these fish?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head right there. I think water temperature is simply going to be what's going to restrict, I think, these watersheds from doing the best or doing the most they can to support recovery of fish. The habitat conditions in the upper watershed are not so poor that if fish were able to access there, that would be maybe an area to focus direct restoration work. But my fear is that until the passage issues are dealt with, that the more important thing is to address water quality and temperature in the lower watershed, which also includes that access of cool water refugia in that lower area. And those might be very, very small tributaries that we haven't even looked at yet, from a habitat assessment perspective. So that's maybe a way to focus efforts, I guess.
Sure. So temperature is kind of the overarching topic here, but then different ways of getting at keeping the cool temperatures and the cool water refugias, discovering where those are, and then focusing on that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, Mapano Dam and the reservoir, Beaver Lake, are a huge issue in the Abernathy system, but we're not going to get rid of that soon. So emphasizing those areas where fish can access colder water is really key.
Yeah.
Great. Hey, I see a question from a guest here in the chat that I want to address just quickly, which is, are there volunteer opportunities? Yes, there are. So we have a number of different ways with the council, and we're developing more. In fact, Derek and Willow are part of their effort in working with our council is to advance our volunteer opportunities. So I'd like to just suggest that they can reach out to you and follow up with ways to get involved with the council. We hold monthly board meetings. Our board meeting will be next Tuesday evening. But if you go onto our website and send me an email, I can connect you up with Derek and Willow, and they can let you know specific opportunities based on what you've got that you'd like to do. So there is a kind of a nest of questions here that Derek has asked around Mapano Dam and removal and fish passage. But I just, I think what I'd like to do, Derek, if it's all right with you, is I'm just going to kind of couch the question to you both as, what beyond dams, which are kind of an obvious one, what are other barriers to fish passage that we have to deal with?
Well, I think many of them are the unknowns right now, and most of those are private road culverts that we've never seen before and have never been documented on a survey. So it requires surveying the smaller tributaries and talking to landowners and making sure that you don't miss a particular culvert, because if you don't get access to one piece of land, that might have the barrier on it that caused the problem in the watershed. So like a passage survey needs to be comprehensive, meaning you need to talk to everybody to ensure that whatever small tributary we're talking about, fish do have access to the cold water refugia that's there. Otherwise they're forced to rear in Abernathy, which could mean mortality to a large number of fish.
Sure. Well, I think this really points up for me, what the term stakeholder, I mentioned it earlier on, but we're all in a sense stakeholders in this watershed if we care about it and if we want to see the conditions improve. But then there are the stakeholders who actually have property adjacent to the creek or have an influence on the creek, and really trying to get their involvement is something that happens, I think, person to person and through relationships. And so I'm hopeful that we can continue to build relationships and interest around this watershed and these watersheds, and get more and more people to see that it can be sometimes not vast, expensive actions, but small, meaningful actions that can add up to big change for the watershed. So, well, hey, I'm just looking in the chat here and also looking at the time, and I think we've run a little bit long, which is not surprising because this is a very interesting topic. So I want to thank you both. I want to mention to people that we have 2 more webinars in the series coming up. Human and Wildlife Interactions with Bill Weiler is on April 5th. So next month, a week from today, a month from today. And then I will be sharing what is tentatively titled right now, Birds in Our Watershed. And I'll be sharing some opportunities and leading a webinar on birds because I'm an avid birder, and would really like to share with you their view from above of the watershed and the many opportunities to see them and learn about them. So that's happening on May 3rd. But I want to thank you again for joining tonight. If you're interested in learning more about our council, please visit gocwc.org is our website right now. Derek is working real hard with the team here to update that website, but it's still up and running right now, and you can get in touch with us that way. So thank you again for joining, and Todd and John, thank you for this evening. Do the visual claps here, and we'll catch you next time. Please do stick around because we have this big tricky question to ask you. So stand by. All right. Well, great job to both of you. We're still live here, and this question is not so particularly esoteric that anyone who does want to stay on can't listen in on it. So the puzzle that we're pondering here, John, is the stream length of Abernethy Creek and all of its tributaries down to a 100th of a mile. Yeah.
Tom, is the question asking like the stream length that the plan covered? So we would only basically include the stream length that is within fish distribution?
Let me pull up this interesting document with its question. I'll pull it up. I won't have you don't have to look at it, but let me just read verbatim what we've got going on here. So this is in summary metrics. And those of you who are still on the call, we're doing a report here on Abernethy Creek and the Strategic Restoration Action Plan that Todd authored for us, which has been a great guiding document. So the question is, summary metrics apply to all of the restoration planning and coordination activities reported. And the question says, miles of stream encompassed or affected by this technical assistance project to the nearest 0.01 mile.
I would say then you focus on fish distribution streams, because that's really what is affected by the assessment.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so John, we're talking about the Strategic Restoration Action Plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I think it should be fish distribution would be the area where you'd want to take on actions, et cetera. So I think, and that's pretty well defined.
And do you know if that linear number exists in, Todd, do you know if it's in the rapid bioassessment? Yeah, it's not. So Derek did some digging around on GIS to answer this question. And he came up with some interesting numbers based on looking at the GIS shape files for the main stem of Abernethy and then for all tributaries. And Derek, I don't know if you want to share screen here.
Yeah, I can do that.
I'm going to stop the recording actually.